Thank you for those kind words of introduction, Paul. I hope to earn those kind words, so hopefully this goes well. I'd first like to thank the Unitarian congregation for their kind gift. I was last with you when you had an offering that then went to our American Indian Scholarship Fund. And I'm very pleased to tell you that our enrollment of Native students for this semester is 756, which is our second highest enrollment. A couple of years ago, we had many more, but it's particularly important that we're able to provide assistance to our students in need, particularly as the cost of education has become quite high. I have a couple of connections with you all. One is that until you moved to the present building that you now have, the church on 25th, we shared Sundays at Pilgrim Congregational Church, and I'm very pleased that you now have a home that's your own. And the second point of contact is that I once lived, my family and I, 2 houses from the church on the 25th. So we were neighbors in a very literal sense at one point. I appreciate that Paul acknowledged the tribal connections to this valley. It's something that we're trying to do very consciously at MSU, and so we did prepare a land acknowledgement, which I'd like to share with you. Not that Paul's wasn't adequate. It's certainly something that bears repeating and reminding. And the phrase that we use, or the sentence that we use, is, "We acknowledge and honor with respect the indigenous nations on whose tribal homelands Bozeman now stands, and whose historical and cultural relationships with the land continue to this day. We ask our spiritual ancestors to forgive our intrusion and humbly ask for their guidance." A proper introduction, though, needs to include a little bit more than just my English name, as sometimes we say. My name in the Kickapoo language, of which I'm a member, is Wasasuk, and that means light lying down. And it was my grandfather's name. And in our tradition, our names are recycled, if you will, passed down to another generation when we pass. And in that way, the essence of our being is continued on from generation to generation. And I'm a member of the White Bear Clan. So I tell you that in case there are other White Bear Clan members listening in. You're related to me, and so that's always a good thing. Today we're going to be talking about the legacy of Conquest and focusing on, as you've already heard, Indigenous Peoples Day and the legacy of Columbus, the C word, I guess, as sometimes it's called. I guess I'm kind of in a no-win situation here, so you'll have to bear with me. At times, my students think that I'm too preachy, and here I have a chance to be preachy, and I risk being too academic. So I need to make sure that I sort of hit that soft spot, and I'll try not to be quite as academic as I might be otherwise. But I can assure you that none of this is going to be on the text, so you don't have to take notes or pay attention for that matter. Yeah. And I think all of us, to find a place to begin, all of us, I think, have had experience with, I'm starting my timer here so I don't go too far over. I remember when I was in grade school, this is in the 1950s, when our history books all began in 1492. And we all had to learn the song. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And for the life of me, I don't know if there was anything else that followed that phrase. I don't remember, but that's sort of what we were expected to know, is that history begins in America in 1492. And so that being the mythology, I thought we'd talk a little bit about its antecedents. And actually, when I start talking about the legacy of Columbus, we need to go back into the 1450s, even before Columbus set sail. I do want to share a story, though. Several years ago, we were trying to convince the city commissioners to change the Columbus Day celebration to Indigenous Peoples Day. And so we had a number of methods, and one of them was to raise, to circulate a petition and present that to the city council. And so I guess it was a Christmas stroll. We were all downtown. We had our little booth there and our clipboards, and we were asking people to sign our petition, which would recognize Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day. And I was standing downtown, and I had clipboard at hand when I saw a gentleman coming down, and I try to read people and see what possible interest they might have, and if they're a friendly type, I might approach them. And so I saw this guy coming down, and he didn't look very approachable. In fact, he was kind of scowly, and I thought, well, I don't know, maybe I'll give it a shot. And so he stopped at the booth, and he said, "What are you selling?" And I said, "Well, not selling anything. We're just gathering petitions. We want to not recognize Columbus Day." And he paused, and you could kind of see him lighten up inside. And he says, "Yeah," he says, "that's something I can get behind." And he said, "Columbus didn't discover America." And I thought, oh, great, here's a convert. And he said, "Everybody knows the Vikings did." And I remember thinking, that's the fundamental challenge that we have when we talk about Columbus Day, is that it's always associated with discovery. But the problem there is that that's not the biggest legacy. That's not the biggest challenge that we face. It's not necessarily who was here first, because certainly we know that Columbus didn't make landfall in what's now America, or the United States rather. So his connection to America, at least the United States, is very, very distant. And we know that there were people certainly living here before that. But what I'd like to do is focus on something that's a little bit less known and not well understood. And that's the doctrine of title by discovery. And perhaps we haven't heard much about that because it's not necessarily something that everybody, looks at in terms of a critical eye. It's something that we accept, title by discovery. And so, we need to go back and see how that concept emerged. And its earliest antecedents are with a series of papal bulls that were issued by various popes beginning in the 1450s. Now, there's a whole history of those, and I won't go into those so deeply, but certainly it bears at least a cursory examination. For example, if we look at a papal bull issued in 1452 by Pope Nicholas VI, and in that papal bull, the Pope authorized Alfonso V of Portugal, and let me quote part of that, to quote, invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. And what essentially the Pope is doing is authorizing the king to go out and enslave in Africa at this time, because this is obviously before 1492. And so what we have is the papal bulls, the direction or the allowance of the popes to seize land and to conquer, if you will, Saracens, unbelievers, and pagans, non-Christians. And so the legacy of Columbus begins even well before he set sail. Now, some of you may know the history of this better than I, but for example, one general argument was who should have monopoly over the souls, if you will, of undiscovered countries. And so the Pope, actually different popes, then addressed this by dividing up the known universe between Spain and Portugal, and dividing by a line who had dominion over those souls. And so by the time 1492 comes around, there's already a history of land acquisition or conquest and the enslavement of people. And so we have to recognize that Columbus, as he is going out and exploring, as it were, is doing so already under the direction of the earthly representative of deity. And so by the time he comes to the Americas, he's under instruction that the Catholic faith and Christian religion be everywhere spread and increased, that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the state itself. So under Christian international law, then, heathens and infidels, which were their terms, were considered less than human. One of the challenges that we have is that all of this is from outside. That is to say, Native peoples considered themselves to be human. Our very names for ourselves, Salish, Tehistasis, mean the people, the original people. And so this idea that we are going out and conquering people because we want to make them civilized is obviously one of the legacies of Columbus. There's even an argument between De las Casas in 1550, who is in debate with Sepulveda about whether or not Indian people have souls. And all of this plays into this idea that because the land is absent of Christian people, then it's an empty land. It is vacuum domicilium, that idea of an empty land. And therefore, this idea of discovery follows. Now, it's well into this century, that belief. There is a quote that I recall from an early I guess a missionary, and I'll quote that. There was some part of the land that was not purchased, neither was there need that it be should. It was vacuum domicilium, and so might be possessed by virtue of God's grant to mankind. Genesis 1:28, and God blessed them, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over everything that moveth upon the earth. The Indians made no use of it, but for hunting, by God's first grant, men were to subdue the earth. When Adam came into the land of Canaan, he made use of vacant land as he pleased, as did Isaac and Jacob. And so this idea that the land is empty and therefore uninhabited by Christian people is one that we have a long history of. And so the question you might ask is, well, what does that have to do with anything? And my answer is that in 1823, the Christian doctrine of discovery was quietly introduced into US law by a Supreme Court case called Johnson versus McIntosh. And in Johnson versus McIntosh, the idea that Indians do not own the land became something that was recognized in a legal sense in the United States. A little bit of background to the case Johnson versus McIntosh. There was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Johnson who purchased some land from the Illinois and Pankashaw tribes. And I guess the Illinois, their homeland is Illinois, so that one's an easy one. And so the Johnson thought the deal was done. But later on, there was a gentleman by the name of William McIntosh who bought land from the United States that was previously ceded by the Illinois tribes. And so the descendants of Johnson believed that McIntosh didn't have title to that land because they originally acquired it from the Pakansaw and Illinois tribe. And so whose land did it belong to? Did it belong to Johnson, or who purchased it from the Indian tribe? Or did it belong to McIntosh, who purchased it from the United States? And so the consequence was that there was a Supreme Court case, and it was under the Chief Justice Marshall that the decision was rendered. And the decision that the Supreme Court made was that Christian European nations assumed ultimate dominion, to use Marshall's word, over the lands of America during the Age of Discovery. And that upon discovery, the native people lost their right to complete sovereignty as independent nations. And they only retained the right of occupancy in their land. And so by doing so, the United States recognized the concept of discovery, this very vague finders, keepers, losers, weepers kind of policy. And that discovery, in the words of the court, gave title to the government by whose subject or whose authority it is made against all other European governments. And so we've operated under that doctrine ever since. So consequently, when a tribe entered into a treaty, basically the federal government is only negotiating to extinguish their right of occupancy. They're not acquiring the land because, according to the Marshall decision, the native peoples never owned their land. They only had the right of occupancy. And that's a decision that not many people are aware of. And the consequence of that is that from that point on, our title is vague. It's recognized by this antiquated concept of title. There is a Paul Harvey ending to this, and I won't go into it very deeply, but some of you may be old enough to know who Paul Harvey is. He always told these wonderful little stories, and at the end he said, and now for the rest of the story. And then he'd tell some anecdote about the story that he just told. And so there is a Paul Harvey ending to this. And that is that there are two other court cases that were decided by the Marshall courts called the Marshall Trilogy, in which the Cherokee title to the land is disputed. And as a consequence, the Cherokees lost their court case against the state of Georgia when gold is discovered, and consequently were removed from the state of Georgia to what's now Oklahoma or Indian Territory. And you can certainly follow up on that on your own. Cherokee versus Georgia and Worcester versus Georgia. But the upshot of all of this is that when we look at the consequence of the legacy of Columbus, when we look at the consequence of discovery, it's not necessarily who discovered the lands first. We certainly already understand that. But what was the legacy that Columbus ushered in with this idea of title by discovery? And I'm not suggesting there's an easy way out of that one, because certainly people like the Lakota still believe that that the Black Hills is theirs, and that the Gallatin Valley is still the homeland of many tribes. And so when we start with this land acknowledgement, we understand that those are people's traditional homelands, and thank you, Paul, for reminding us very early that's we are sitting, and I don't say stolen land, but rather it's land that's been borrowed, and no one owns it. We're just allowed to live here. And finally, I'd like to thank you once again for allowing me to share my ideas, my perspectives. And I very much am humbled by having been asked to be with you today, and I certainly extend my heartfelt thanks to you for all of the good heart and good thoughts that you bring today. And so with that, I'll return you back to your local station for programming. Thank you for shopping Kmart.